Imagine sitting on a flight, cradling your baby, thinking the journey ahead is just another ordinary trip. But then, in a split second, everything changes. Naomi Carter, a calm and strong mother, finds herself at the center of a storm she never expected, a moment where privilege, prejudice, and power collide right above the clouds. A simple seat assignment spirals into a confrontation that shakes not only the passengers around her, but also challenges the very essence of justice and human empathy. What would you do if someone tried to take away your dignity in a public space? Could you stay composed when your child is the silent witness to injustice? And how far would someone go to protect what is right in the midst of chaos? These are the questions Naomi faces as she navigates the tension, the anger, and the moral complexity unfolding thousands of feet above the ground. This is not just a story about a flight. It's about courage, integrity, and the quiet strength that rises when confrontation feels impossible. Stay with us as we unravel every shocking, emotional, and thought-provoking moment that happened on that airplane. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single heartbeat of this unforgettable journey. The slap rang out across the cabin like a gunshot, silencing the chatter of passengers and freezing the low hum of the air system. A single moment, one palm striking flesh ripped through the ordinary routine of boarding a flight. Every eye in row 12 turned, every body stiffened. For a heartbeat, the plane seemed to stop breathing. Naomi Carter's head snapped to the side from the impact. Her skin burned where the flight attendant's hand had connected. She was cradling her 8-month-old daughter, Amara, who whimpered softly against her chest. Naomi did not scream, did not curse, did not lash out. She pressed her lips together, her jaw taut, and adjusted Amara's small body closer to her own. The baby's tiny fingers clutched at her blouse as if sensing the need for protection. Gas filled the cabin, followed by the telltale glow of smartphone cameras being raised into the air. A young man 2 rows ahead fumbled to open a live stream. An older woman in the back muttered, "Oh my God," while lifting her iPhone. Every action, every breath, every look in that moment was being recorded. Standing over her, flight attendant Susan Miller loomed with an expression twisted between irritation and contempt. Her uniform badge gleamed under the overhead lights. 15 years of service stitched in corporate pride across her chest. "People like you need to learn your place on my aircraft," she snarled, her voice loud enough for the entire section to hear. Her heel caught Naomi's diaper bag, kicking it down the aisle. Formula packets spilled across the carpet. Tiny onesies tumbled into the path of boarding passengers. Naomi inhaled slowly, her chest rising with the kind of controlled breath that comes from deep wells of inner discipline. Don't react, not yet. Don't give them what they expect. She gathered Amara closer, pressing a kiss into her baby's soft hair, and turned her gaze back to the woman who had struck her. Her dark eyes were steady, unyielding. The slap itself was painful. Yes, but humiliation carried a sting far worse. To be degraded in public while holding her child, there was no comparison. She wanted to scream, to stand up, to push back, but she knew one wrong move could change the entire trajectory of this flight, and maybe even her life. In the quiet corners of her mind, a thought surfaced. If I raise my voice now, they'll call me angry. If I stay calm, maybe the truth will speak louder than fury. Around her, passengers shifted. A businessman pretended to nap, but his shoulders stiffened with each word that came from Susan's mouth. A teenage girl whispered into her phone camera, her followers piling in with comments that scrolled across the screen faster than she could read. "Did that really just happen?" one wrote. "She slapped a mom holding her baby," said another. Susan's voice cut again, sharp and commanding. Clean that up. Now, some of us have real jobs to do." She gestured to the scattered baby items as if Naomi were some nuisance, some obstacle to be dealt with. Her tone carried an authority that was not rooted in professionalism, but in arrogance. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the floor, scanning the mess, and then returned her gaze upward. With quiet steadiness, she said, "This is my assigned seat. I paid for it 3 weeks ago. Row 12, Seat A." She held her boarding pass in her free hand, the black print clear and undeniable. Susan folded her arms, blocking the narrow aisle with her body. "Not anymore. Premium passengers need the window today." She tapped her foot against the floor, each strike deliberate, like a drumbeat announcing her authority. Naomi blinked slowly, her mind processing the absurdity. Premium passengers. In economy class? She searched the cabin for any sign of such a designation, but there was none. A young woman in row 13 shook her head quietly, lifting her phone higher to capture the scene. Naomi's cheeks still throbbed, her skin growing warm with the mark of humiliation, but her voice remained calm, layered with a dignity that could not be erased by one slap. Susan leaned down, so close her breath fanned Naomi's ear. "Move to the middle seat, or I'll call security." Her finger jabbed near Amara's face, making the baby flinch and whimper again. Naomi's stomach tightened, protective instinct surging, but she held herself steady. She rocked Amara gently, whispering, "Mama's here. Baby girl. Mama's here." Her tone was soft, melodic, a lullaby against chaos. The contrast was striking a mother's tenderness against the backdrop of aggression. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked ready to intervene, but hesitated, uncertain of how far the situation would escalate. The silence between voices stretched thin, charged like the moment before a storm. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, remembering the weight of past lessons, her grandmother's wisdom, her mother's warnings. You will face times when silence is your shield, but silence cannot be forever. Choose your moment. Protect your dignity. Protect your child. When she opened her eyes again, her composure had hardened into something almost supernatural. She looked at Susan and said, clearly enough for those around to hear, "My daughter and I will remain in our assigned seats." Her words did not rise in volume, but each syllable carried the weight of conviction. Phones tilted forward, capturing her poise. Comments online began to explode. "She's so calm. I'd have lost it by now. Protect that baby." What had begun as a private humiliation was already turning into a public confrontation, one that strangers across the internet were witnessing in real time. Susan's jaw clenched, her knuckles whitening around her crossed arms. The authority she had wielded so carelessly was beginning to slip under the pressure of so many eyes. But her pride held strong, and she spat back, "Final warning." Naomi kissed Amara's forehead again, the baby's warmth grounding her in the midst of fire. She was not only fighting for her seat, she was standing against a system that believed power meant permission to harm. The cabin buzzed with tension. The slap still echoed, not just against her skin, but in the conscience of every witness. And though Naomi's voice was steady, her thoughts were anything but. How much more can I endure? What if they remove us? What if Amara remembers the fear in my eyes? She pushed those doubts down, burying them beneath the armor of calm resolve, because in this moment, she knew the real battle had only just begun. Susan Miller didn't back down. Her chin jutted forward, lips pressed thin, eyes locked on Naomi like a predator sizing up its prey. She bent closer, her shadow falling across Naomi's cheek as if the slap had not been enough. The baby clothes scattered on the floor seemed to mock the scene, a child's innocence thrown into the dirt because of someone else's arrogance. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A man in a polo shirt leaned back in his seat, muttering under his breath. This isn't right, but he did not stand. Nobody did. Phones continued to record, tiny lenses capturing every sneer, every breath, every glance. Naomi felt Amara's little chest rising and falling against her own. The baby had stopped crying, though a small whimper bubbled now and again. Naomi kissed the top of her daughter's head. She wanted to believe that love alone could shield her child from ugliness. But the sting on her cheek reminded her that sometimes love needed to be sharpened into armor. "This seat isn't yours anymore," Susan snapped, her voice projecting as if to recruit the audience around her. "You heard me. Move. Now." She kicked the last of the formula packets farther down the aisle, scattering them like unwanted debris. "You should be grateful we're even letting you on this flight." Naomi let the words hang, choosing not to reply immediately. She knew the danger of quick retorts. They satisfied emotion, but often played into the hands of those waiting to call her difficult or angry. She inhaled slowly, then said, clear and calm, "I paid for this ticket. I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. Row 12. Seat A. Window seat." She raised the boarding pass higher. The barcodes gleamed under the overhead light. Indisputable proof. Susan scoffed. "You think a little piece of paper means more than my authority. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what premium passengers require. And you, ma'am, are not premium." The word premium slid off her tongue like poison. Naomi could almost hear the subtext, not premium because of the color of your skin, because of the way you look, because of what I think you are. The insult was less about policy and more about placing her beneath others, beneath dignity itself. Naomi felt a heat spread through her chest, anger pounding against her ribs, begging for release, but she kept her face smooth. She thought of her grandmother's voice again. Choose your moment. She would not let Susan dictate when that moment arrived. From the row behind, an elderly woman's voice rang out. "Leave her alone," she said, her tone trembling, but firm. She held her phone high. "Recording. She's done nothing wrong." Susan turned sharply. "Mind your business," she barked, though her voice cracked slightly at the edges. "Everyone needs to remain seated." But the crack had been noticed. Authority, once questioned, never felt as solid again. Ethan Rivera, the college student, angled his phone so the live stream caught both Susan's towering posture and Naomi's calm, unyielding expression. Comments flooded his screen. "She's incredible. I'd be shaking right now. Get her badge number. This is discrimination on camera." Ethan's viewers climbed into the thousands within minutes. He glanced at Naomi, his face a mix of awe and sympathy, then focused his lens tighter. Naomi adjusted Amara, shifting the baby onto her other arm. Her shoulder ached from the weight, but she refused to set her daughter down on the dirty carpet. Amara's fingers clutched at her blouse again, as if reminding her, "Don't let go. Don't let them win." Susan leaned in once more, her perfume sharp and suffocating. "Look at me when I talk to you," she ordered. "You don't get to ignore me." Naomi turned her head slowly, deliberately, until her eyes met Susan's. The calmness in her gaze startled the flight attendant. It wasn't submission. It was something stronger, something unbreakable. "My child and I will stay in this seat, Naomi said softly. Yet every passenger heard it. This is our place. This is our right. Her words settled over the cabin, heavier than the recycled air. Even the businessman who had pretended to nap opened his eyes. For the first time, silence favored Naomi rather than Susan, but humiliation still clung thickly in the air. Naomi could feel it coating her skin like grime. She was tired of being the spectacle, tired of the eyes that pitied and the eyes that judged. She wanted to cry, to scream, to vanish. Instead, she kissed Amara's hair again, grounding herself in the scent of baby powder and innocence. Inside, though, her thoughts churned. What if they drag me off this plane? What if Amara grows up remembering fear instead of love? What if staying calm isn't enough this time? Her heart raced, but she refused to let her hand tremble. She would not give Susan the satisfaction of seeing fear. Susan straightened, looking around the cabin for support she no longer had. Too many phones were pointed at her. Too many eyes glared disapproval. Yet pride can be more stubborn than truth. She lifted her chin and declared, "Final warning. Move to the middle seat or I'll call security right now." The words echoed like a threat of exile. Naomi tightened her hold on Amara, feeling her daughter's warmth seep into her chest. She looked down at her baby, then back up at Susan. Her voice, calm as ever, carried the weight of defiance. "Then call them." The hush that followed was deafening. Passengers exchanged looks of shock and admiration. A mother holding her infant had just stared down a uniformed attendant and refused to yield. Naomi's cheeks still burned. Her dignity felt bruised. Yet in that moment, she was not only enduring humiliation, she was transforming it into quiet strength. She had not raised her voice, had not cursed, had not lashed out. She had simply stood firm. And that firmness was beginning to unravel the very authority that tried to crush her. Phones continued to record. The internet was watching. The humiliation Susan had intended as a tool of control was becoming evidence that could not be erased, not from memory, not from video, not from the collective conscience of everyone witnessing injustice unfold 30,000 feet above ground. Naomi breathed again, steady and measured. Her humiliation was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The cabin felt suffocating, yet it was alive with silent judgment and curiosity. Naomi could sense every eye on her, some filled with empathy, others with discomfort, and a few with disdain that mirrored Susan's own pride. Even Amara seemed to notice, turning her tiny head as if aware of the tension saturating the air. From the back of the plane, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard leaned slightly forward, resting his arms on the tray table. His eyes flicked between Naomi and Susan, an invisible scale measuring fairness and injustice. He whispered to the woman beside him, whose fingers tightened around the armrest. "I've never seen anything like this. She's holding her ground and staying calm. Incredible." Naomi felt the weight of attention pressing down, almost like gravity pulling her closer to the floor. She had endured the initial humiliation, but now the cabin was a living organism, breathing reactions and emotions. Each observer added another layer of scrutiny, and the knowledge that every gesture, every glance, was under watch made her heart pound in a steady rhythm of fear and determination. Ethan Rivera continued recording. His voice was low and hushed, commenting softly to his viewers. "Watch her. She's not flinching. She's showing what real strength looks like." He angled the camera to capture the expressions of those around Naomi, their eyes widening in awe, their murmurs barely contained. The cabin had become a stage. Naomi unwillingly, the lead actor, and everyone else, the jury. Across the aisle, an elderly woman in a lavender scarf pressed her hand to her lips. Tears glimmered in her eyes, unashamed and unhidden. "She's teaching them," she murmured to herself. "Every mother should know this courage." Naomi caught her gaze for a brief moment. The silent acknowledgment sent a warmth through her chest that offset the sting of Susan's earlier aggression. Still, the tension was palpable. Naomi could feel Susan's presence looming like a storm cloud. The attendant's hands were clenched, knuckles white, every line of her body radiating suppressed anger. Susan had underestimated the collective power of witnesses, of people unwilling to remain passive in the face of blatant injustice. A young woman with red hair shifted in her seat, whispering fervently to her friend. "We can't just sit here. We need to support her somehow." Her words were tentative, almost afraid to break the fragile calm. Yet Naomi understood the courage it took to speak in that moment. Every whisper, every glance, was a quiet act of defiance, rippling through the cabin like an unseen wave. Naomi's mind drifted briefly to her own upbringing, to the lessons instilled by her parents and grandparents. Stand firm, speak only when necessary, show strength through composure. The principles were not just survival strategies, but shields against the daily indignities that life seemed to throw, unbidden, at those who dared to exist authentically in a world that sometimes wanted them invisible. Her heart ached, though not just for herself or her baby, but for the collective humanity in the cabin. These people, strangers all, were the witnesses who might transform a moment of cruelty into something meaningful. Naomi allowed herself a fleeting smile. Maybe endurance and presence could shift the balance. Maybe courage could ripple outward beyond this confined space. A man in a business suit, normally absorbed in his laptop, finally spoke. "She's right. You can't treat her this way. Period." His voice was calm but firm, the authority in his tone undeniable. Susan turned, face flushed, struggling to maintain the pretense of control. Naomi saw the fissures in her composure, subtle cracks that even she could not have created deliberately. Even the flight attendants in the cabin began to shift uneasily. Some glanced at Naomi with hesitant empathy. Others avoided her eyes, caught between policy and personal ethics. One younger attendant whispered something to a colleague, their words lost in the ambient hum of the cabin, but the intent was unmistakable support, even if silent, was building around Naomi. Naomi felt Amara squirm slightly in her arms, the baby's small hand brushing against her cheek. The motion grounded her, tethered her to something pure and untainted. She whispered softly, "Stay close to me, little one. We will get through this together." The words were barely audible, a mother's vow carried on the air, yet they resonated in a way that seemed to anchor the witnesses as well. Outside, the engines roared steadily, oblivious to the human drama within the cabin. Inside, every sigh, every hesitant movement, every whispered encouragement was magnified by the tension. Naomi could feel the energy of those around her, the collective empathy building an invisible shield. Each passenger, knowingly or unknowingly, had become a participant in her defense. Then a young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, she's being treated unfairly." The mother's eyes met Naomi's, and she nodded slowly. "I know, sweetie, but we'll do the right thing." The boy's small voice carried across the aisle, a simple truth cutting through the tension with disarming clarity. Naomi felt a spark of hope, innocence. After all, often recognized injustice before adulthood muddled perception with politeness. Ethan's livestream continued to expand. Thousands of viewers watching the unfolding moment of quiet resilience. Comments poured in from around the world. "She's a hero. This is what standing up looks like. I hope the airline sees this." Naomi's chest tightened at the thought of a global audience. Yet she reminded herself that her gaze remained focused on her immediate reality, the baby in her arms, the witnesses surrounding her, and the woman who had struck her still standing too close. Susan's hand shook imperceptibly, her voice wavering as she tried again to assert authority. "You need to sit down. This is not negotiable." But the words lacked conviction. Authority requires acknowledgement, and the cabin no longer provided it willingly. Naomi inhaled, counting slowly to 10. She felt the pulse of the witnesses, the silent collective heartbeat of those who had seen her wronged and were unwilling to ignore it. Their observation, once passive, had turned into a protective embrace. She realized then that courage was not just individual, it was communal. It was built in the spaces between people who refused to look away. The elderly woman in lavender, still recording, smiled faintly. The young boy beside his mother nodded in quiet understanding. Ethan adjusted his camera to include a sweeping view of the cabin. Naomi could sense the shift in energy, subtle but undeniable. Humiliation had been replaced, at least partially, by validation. The witnesses were no longer merely spectators. They were participants in the moral argument, in the unspoken declaration that abuse and prejudice would not go uncontested. Naomi felt the first real wave of relief since the altercation began, not because the threat had disappeared, but because she realized she was not alone. The truth, however small and fragmented, had allies. She could survive this moment, stand tall, and continue to shield Amara with dignity. The tension in the cabin remained, but now it was punctuated with glimmers of hope. Each witness, each person who chose to see and acknowledge, was a thread in a fragile but growing tapestry of support. Naomi felt her shoulders lighten, her breathing steady, and then, almost imperceptibly, Susan's gaze faltered. The witnesses had done their work. They had seen, recorded, and acknowledged. Authority without recognition was powerless. And in that quiet realization, Naomi knew the tide had begun to turn. Naomi felt her pulse thicken as Susan stepped closer, the harsh click of her shoes echoing against the cabin floor. Every eye in the plane seemed to follow her like a spotlight. Yet Naomi remained rooted, Amara cradled securely in her arms. Susan's lips pressed into a thin line, her anger simmering just below the surface, every muscle in her body taut with suppressed fury. "You need to sit down now," Susan snapped, her voice sharp and brittle, as though the tension in the air were a tangible weapon she could wield. Naomi inhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment to assess the situation. She felt the heat rising in her face, but she did not flinch. Calmness was her shield, the armor forged through years of quietly enduring and observing the world's harshest edges. "I am sitting where I choose," Naomi replied, her voice steady but firm, resonating with an unexpected authority. She glanced around the cabin, noticing subtle nods from passengers who had previously seemed unsure or hesitant. The atmosphere shifted, the collective awareness of injustice gathering momentum, like wind swelling before a storm. Susan's eyes narrowed, her confidence cracking. She had not anticipated resistance, certainly not resistance observed and silently supported by an audience. Her role as the enforcer, the authority on this flight, felt suddenly fragile under the scrutiny of both her peers and the passengers. Ethan's camera captured the unfolding tension, his commentary soft yet intense. "Look at her composure. She isn't afraid. Watch how every movement is measured. She knows what she's doing. This is what it means to stand up without losing control. Naomi caught glimpses of the live chat overlay. Viewers around the world offering encouragement and expressing disbelief at the audacity of the confrontation. The awareness of the digital audience did not intimidate her, but it added a layer of responsibility. She was not just protecting herself and Amara. She was bearing witness to the broader implications of the moment. Amara stirred in her arms, her small body shifting slightly as if sensing the tension in the air. Naomi adjusted her hold, murmuring softly, "I've got you. We are okay." The whispered reassurance was both for Amara and for herself, a grounding mantra against the chaos encroaching from Susan's presence. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Susan demanded, her voice shaking slightly now, revealing the thin veneer of control. Naomi could see the subtle quiver in her hands and the tension around her jaw. Authority without credibility is brittle, and Naomi felt the delicate balance tipping in her favor. "Yes," Naomi said simply, her eyes meeting Susan's with quiet intensity. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers leaned slightly forward, their subtle movements creating a ripple of energy. Even the flight attendant stationed near the back seemed unsure how to intervene. The incident had transformed from a personal clash into a social examination, a test of ethics and empathy in real time. A man with a gray sweater whispered to his companion, "She's not just standing up for herself. She's teaching everyone on this flight a lesson about respect and boundaries." The words carried across the aisle, reaching Naomi, a quiet validation that strengthened her resolve. She was no longer isolated. The witnesses were active participants now, their presence a shield of moral gravity that Susan could not easily breach. Susan took a step closer, and Naomi's instincts sharpened. Her mind raced with calculations. If she moved, she risked escalating the confrontation physically, which she could not allow. If she remained still, she risked giving Susan psychological leverage. Naomi decided that she would let her words act as the defense, each syllable a brick in an unshakable wall. "You are making a mistake," Susan said, her voice wavering between anger and fear. Naomi tilted her head slightly, listening, observing. Fear was subtle but present, undermining the aggression that had driven the initial slap. Naomi understood that confrontation was not just about asserting power. It was about revealing the cracks in false authority. "I am not the one making the mistake," Naomi replied softly, yet her tone cut through the cabin with precision. "You are choosing anger over reason, and your actions are visible to everyone here. That is the real mistake." The cabin responded in small, almost imperceptible ways. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering to neighbors, others nodding subtly. Even the young boy from earlier seemed to straighten in his seat, absorbing the moral clarity in Naomi's words. The energy in the plane was changing, a slow, deliberate tide that Naomi could feel pressing against Susan's rigid posture. Susan's face flushed, a mixture of rage and embarrassment. Naomi noticed the subtle tremor in her hands as she raised them in a gesturing motion, almost pleading, almost threatening. Naomi felt a pang of empathy, recognizing that Susan's aggression was rooted in fear and insecurity, though it did not excuse her behavior. Amara's soft cooing drew Naomi's attention briefly, a reminder of the stakes. This was not just a confrontation between two adults. It was a lesson being witnessed by a child, a formative moment that would ripple into the future. Naomi's heart tightened with both love and responsibility. Every word, every pause, every gesture carried weight beyond the immediate conflict. I am responsible for this baby's safety and dignity," Naomi continued, her voice unwavering, "and I will not compromise either for the comfort of someone who refuses to see the truth." Her words resonated through the cabin, a quiet proclamation of justice that seemed to lift the collective consciousness. Ethan's camera captured the expressions of the passengers. A young woman clutched her friend's hand, tears forming silently. A businessman stared, jaw tight, the sense of moral clarity reflecting in his eyes. Naomi felt the strength of these witnesses, a lattice of empathy and courage that was as solid as any physical barrier. Susan's stance faltered, and Naomi recognized the turning point. The flight attendant had relied on intimidation, on the assumption that Naomi would cower or apologize. That assumption had crumbled, and with it, Susan's dominance. Naomi allowed herself a brief, imperceptible exhale, a release of tension she had carried like armor for far too long. Yet, the confrontation was far from over. Naomi felt the need to maintain her composure, to stay vigilant. Power dynamics are never fully neutralized in a single exchange. They required constant observation, careful navigation, and unwavering presence. She looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of those who had silently supported her. Their acknowledgement fueled her inner strength, a quiet force that anchored her in the storm. Susan's voice softened, almost pleading, almost conciliatory, though the threat still lingered beneath her words. Maybe we can resolve this without further conflict." Naomi met her gaze evenly. She understood the subtext. Susan was seeking control through negotiation now, testing the boundaries of Naomi's patience and resolve. "No further conflict is necessary if respect is acknowledged," Naomi replied calmly. "What is required is honesty and recognition of wrongdoing. That is all." The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The witnesses, the passengers, the flight crew, all absorbed the exchange with a mix of relief and anticipation. Naomi's eyes returned to Amara, feeling the baby's warmth against her chest. She felt a surge of determination. She had endured humiliation, intimidation, and scrutiny, yet she remained unbroken. Susan took a step back, a subtle surrender visible in the slump of her shoulders. Naomi did not celebrate, did not smile openly. Instead, she allowed a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that this confrontation had reached a pivotal moment. Victory was not loud. It was measured, quiet, and profound. The cabin's energy shifted again, now tinged with relief, respect, and cautious admiration. Naomi understood that the confrontation had transcended personal boundaries. It had become a lesson in human dignity, moral courage, and the power of witnesses. As the engines hummed steadily in the background, Naomi held Amara close, feeling the baby's small heartbeat against her own. She realized that every gaze, every whisper, every act of empathy in the cabin had contributed to a moment of shared humanity. She was no longer alone, and the confrontation had become a catalyst for something far larger than herself. Naomi's heart still beat fast, the adrenaline from the confrontation coursing through her veins. She adjusted Amara in her arms and glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit door remained firmly closed. She had hoped the tension would ease, but she knew deep down that authority figures were now inevitable participants. The flight attendant, Susan, lingered awkwardly near the aisle, her previously aggressive posture slightly diminished, yet her eyes still sharp, restless, scanning for an opening to reassert control. A low hum of murmurs swept through the cabin as passengers exchanged quick glances, their expressions reflecting a mix of concern, curiosity, and a dawning sense of moral clarity. Naomi felt the subtle support of the people around her, Yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. Every decision, every pause, could shift the unfolding dynamic in profound ways. She breathed in, centering herself, drawing strength from the warmth of Amara nestled against her chest. The flight attendants at the back began moving forward, their uniforms crisp, their faces composed, but betraying a tension that spoke of careful deliberation. One approached Susan quietly, whispering something in her ear, while another began to address the passengers in a calm, steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience as we resolve an issue in the cabin. Your safety and comfort remain our highest priority." Naomi noted the careful phrasing, the attempt to assert authority without escalating conflict, and she silently approved. From the cockpit, the door slid open, and the voice of Captain Jonathan Hayes came through the intercom. Calm, authoritative, yet laced with an awareness of the situation. He said, "This is Captain Hayes. We have noticed a disturbance in the cabin. I will be coming out to address it personally. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of our crew." Naomi felt the tension shift almost palpably. Authority had entered the equation, and the stakes were no longer just personal. They had become procedural, institutional, and public. Within moments, Captain Hayes appeared in the aisle, a tall figure in a crisp uniform. His presence radiated measured authority. He glanced at Naomi and Amara, then at Susan, and finally surveyed the cabin, taking in the expressions of the passengers. His eyes lingered on Naomi for a brief moment, an unspoken acknowledgment of the courage and composure she displayed. "Ms. Carter," he said, addressing Naomi with a tone that balanced respect and inquiry, "please tell me what happened." Naomi straightened, feeling a surge of resolve. She could have minimized the situation or softened her words, but she knew that honesty was the only way to preserve dignity for herself, Amara, and the passengers. "Captain Hayes," she began, her voice calm but firm, "your crew member, Susan Miller, asked me to give up my seat and slap me while I held my baby. This happened despite my compliance with all seat and safety regulations. The act was unprovoked and has caused distress not only to me, but to everyone witnessing it." Her words carried weight, measured yet piercing, and she noticed several passengers nodding subtly in agreement. Captain Hayes' expression shifted slightly, a mixture of concern and disbelief. He motioned for Susan to step forward. "Miss Miller, can you explain your actions?" The flight attendant's eyes flickered, caught off guard by the direct questioning and the formal recognition of wrongdoing. Her mouth opened, then closed, and she struggled to form a coherent response. I was just trying to maintain order," Susan stammered, her voice unsteady. Naomi felt a pang of recognition of fear and insecurity, the same impulses she had noted earlier. "I didn't mean—" Her words trailed off, and Captain Hayes raised a hand, signaling that she should continue. Naomi's gaze softened slightly toward Susan, though she did not release the intensity of her presence. "Maintaining order does not give anyone the right to harm another human being, especially a mother holding her infant," Naomi said. Her voice was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of moral clarity. Captain Hayes nodded gravely. "Ms. Miller, your behavior violates both company policy and basic decency. We will review this incident thoroughly once we are on the ground. For now, I ask you to remain in your assigned position and refrain from further actions that could escalate the situation." Naomi felt a slight relief. Though she remained vigilant, the structural authority had intervened, but her responsibility to protect herself and Amara persisted. Passengers murmured softly, some expressing quiet relief, others still processing the intensity of the confrontation. Naomi noticed a young woman several rows back wiping tears from her eyes, a silent acknowledgment of the courage she had witnessed. A man in a business suit whispered to his companion, "She didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for all of us." Naomi's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and gravity. This was not a victory born of anger or revenge. It was a victory rooted in dignity and the recognition of shared humanity. Amara stirred slightly, and Naomi adjusted her hold, murmuring soothingly. The small movements of her baby were grounding, a tangible reminder of the responsibility and love that fueled every decision she made. The cabin's energy shifted subtly, from tension and fear to a quiet sense of moral vindication. Naomi felt the collective breath of the passengers exhale in unison, a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of justice in motion. "Ethan, the student filming the scene," whispered near Naomi. "This is incredible. Everyone is watching. They're seeing what courage looks like." Naomi allowed herself a brief smile, a small acknowledgement of the strange, surreal moment of being both participant and witness in a larger narrative. The awareness of an audience, both physical and digital, had added pressure, yet it had also underscored the significance of her composure. Susan remained tense, her posture rigid, her hands clasped nervously. Naomi could sense the internal struggle within her, the oscillation between pride, fear, and embarrassment. She understood, without condoning, the forces that had driven Susan to act: fear of authority, desire for control, and the vulnerability of exposure all mingled in a volatile cocktail. Naomi's empathy was quiet, tempered by the necessity of self-preservation. Captain Hayes turned his attention back to Naomi. "Ms. Carter, thank you for your patience and composure. Your actions have prevented further escalation and ensured the safety and dignity of yourself and your child." Naomi felt a warmth rise in her chest, a recognition of validation without exaggeration. Her eyes met those of the passengers, a shared acknowledgement of endurance and moral clarity that transcended words. Susan's shoulders slumped slightly, a subtle but telling sign of recognition. Naomi sensed that while formal accountability would come later, the moral impact of the confrontation had already left its mark. The flight attendant's actions could no longer stand unchecked in the eyes of the cabin, and the subtle power shift was palpable. Naomi allowed herself a quiet exhale, feeling the first real moment of relief since the initial altercation, yet she remained vigilant, conscious that the journey was not yet complete and that the emotional reverberations of the confrontation would linger. Amara nestled comfortably, a reminder of the stakes and the reason for her unwavering strength. The cabin, once tense and uncertain, now carried a quieter energy, tinged with respect, relief, and cautious admiration. Naomi knew that this moment would linger in the memories of those present, a testament to courage, empathy, and the quiet but formidable power of standing firmly in the face of injustice. The engines continued their steady hum, and Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The authority had intervened, but the human element, the empathy, the courage, and the moral clarity was what had truly shifted the balance. She held Amara close, aware that the baby's small heartbeat mirrored her own determination to navigate this world with dignity, strength, and love. Naomi sank back into her seat, Amara still cradled gently in her arms. The immediate danger had subsided with Captain Hayes' intervention, but a heavier, subtler tension lingered in the cabin air. Naomi's mind buzzed with conflicting thoughts, not just about Susan's behavior, but about the vulnerability she felt in being exposed to the scrutiny of strangers. her most intimate moments laid bare at 30,000 feet. She had expected confrontation, yes, but she hadn't anticipated the weight of judgment, the piercing gaze of strangers whose attention could cut through pretense like a knife. Susan stood stiffly near the galley, her eyes darting nervously between Naomi and the other passengers. Naomi could sense the storm of emotions roiling beneath the flight attendant's polished exterior. Fear, shame, pride, defiance, and guilt, each flicker of emotion was a small battle waged in the open. Naomi, ever perceptive, felt the urge to confront these human frailties with compassion, yet she restrained herself. This was not the moment for empathy. The moment demanded presence, vigilance, and calm authority. Ethan, still filming discreetly from a nearby row, leaned closer to Naomi and whispered, "People are watching. They're talking about what just happened. It's going viral already." Naomi nodded, acknowledging him with a small tilt of her head. The knowledge that her experience would be viewed and dissected by countless others across social media was both empowering and unsettling. The intimacy of her confrontation had become public property, and she had to reconcile the very personal trauma with the broader narrative it had now become. Naomi's thoughts wandered to the other passengers. She noticed a young woman seated across the aisle, nervously clutching her handbag, eyes wide with concern. A father, a few rows ahead, whispered to his child, trying to mask unease with calm words. The elderly man near the window tapped his fingers anxiously on the armrest. Every subtle movement, every glance exchanged, painted a tapestry of shared anxiety, fear, and unspoken judgment. Naomi realized that her ordeal had become a focal point, a prism through which the cabin's collective emotions refracted. Susan, for her part, seemed trapped in her own private turmoil. Naomi could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands twitched ever so slightly. She was caught between the ingrained authority her uniform symbolized and the stark reality of having crossed a line. Naomi's mind wandered momentarily to the psychology of power, to how fear and insecurity could push individuals to extremes, and she felt a pang of understanding tempered by righteous indignation. Power, when unbalanced by empathy, became volatile and destructive. The hum of the engines became almost hypnotic, a low, constant vibration that pressed against Naomi's senses. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a deep breath, and felt Amara stir against her chest. The baby's tiny movements were grounding, a reminder that life, in its most fragile and precious form, continued despite chaos. Naomi's mind drifted to her own mother, recalling the lessons of resilience, dignity, and self-possession that had been imparted through years of quiet example. She had inherited that strength, and now she exercised it in real time, fully aware of the stakes. A subtle ripple of discontent passed through the cabin as passengers murmured among themselves. Naomi overheard fragmented phrases. "Can you believe that just happened? I can't imagine anyone treating a mother like that." She stood her ground so calmly. These murmurs were both comforting and sobering, a reflection of the social pressures and expectations that framed her actions. Naomi realized that her courage was now a part of a social contract. She was being watched, measured, and interpreted, and every movement would be scrutinized for meaning. Susan, sensing the shift, finally spoke to another flight attendant in a low, urgent whisper. Naomi could barely make out the words, but the tone was sharp, defensive, almost panicked. Naomi's pulse quickened as she imagined the calculations and self-justifications running through Susan's mind. Naomi knew that confrontation rarely existed in isolation. It rippled outward, influencing behavior, choices, and moral reckonings in ways that were often unpredictable. She felt an intense empathy for Susan's internal struggle, recognizing that fear and pride could create a storm of actions divorced from morality. Naomi shifted slightly, adjusting Amara's position, and felt the small warmth of the baby's cheek against her shoulder. The simple, tactile reminder of responsibility brought clarity to her swirling thoughts. She understood that fear, vulnerability, and power could collide in violent or subtle ways, but the grounding force of love, care, and moral clarity provided a stabilizing counterweight. Naomi's mind returned to her own internal struggle, balancing outrage with composure, moral certainty with empathy, and the instinct to protect with the principle of restraint. The cabin grew quieter as the collective tension transformed from overt confrontation to an uneasy contemplation. Some passengers leaned back in their seats, processing what they had witnessed. Others exchanged hushed remarks, a silent testament to the impact of Naomi's courage. The flight attendants maintained their positions with careful decorum, subtly aware that any misstep could reignite the latent tension. Naomi, still holding Amara, felt the duality of relief and vigilance. The immediate threat had subsided, but the emotional turbulence remained, layered and persistent. Captain Hayes' voice came through the intercom once again, steady and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. The situation in the cabin has been addressed. We will continue to prioritize safety and order throughout the flight. Thank you." Naomi felt a faint sigh escape her lips, a small release of tension, though the underlying emotional intensity persisted. The captain's words provided reassurance, but the human impact of the earlier confrontation lingered like a shadow, subtle yet pervasive. Naomi's mind drifted to the complexity of public perception. She realized that every choice, every action, was now subject to moral evaluation. Standing firm in the face of injustice had immediate consequences and long-term implications. How would others interpret her courage? Would they see the composure and clarity she believed she exhibited? Or would they focus on her visible fear? The trembling of her hands as she cradled Amara Naomi understood that courage was not merely about facing immediate threats, but about navigating the layered perceptions of society. Susan's internal struggle reached its zenith as she adjusted her posture and avoided eye contact with Naomi. Naomi could feel the unspoken tension radiating from her, a mixture of self-recrimination and defensive pride. It was a subtle yet potent reminder that the battle for dignity was not limited to one person. It was a shared human struggle. Naomi acknowledged this quietly, keeping her focus on Amara, whose soft breathing provided a rhythmic reassurance amidst the chaos. As the flight continued, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. Naomi reflected on the emotional turbulence she had navigated, recognizing the interplay between personal integrity, societal judgment, and institutional authority. She understood that courage required not only confrontation, but also reflection, empathy, and self-awareness. Each passenger, each crew member, had witnessed a moment of moral clarity, and the subtle ripple of understanding and compassion extended beyond the immediate conflict. The quiet intensity of the cabin was punctuated by the occasional soft coo of Amara, grounding Naomi in the present. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper connection to the passengers and crew, and an understanding that moral courage was both personal and communal. The emotional turbulence had not ended, but it had transformed into a shared awareness, a recognition of the fragility and strength inherent in human interaction at close quarters. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, and felt a profound sense of resolve. She knew that the remainder of the flight would carry echoes of this confrontation, subtle reminders of the tension and moral stakes. Yet she also recognized the enduring power of composure, empathy, and moral clarity. In the quiet turbulence of the cabin, amidst the hum of the engines and the rhythmic breaths of those around her, Naomi found a moment of clarity, a sense of alignment between her actions and her values, and a renewed commitment to navigate challenges with strength, dignity, and compassion. The cabin had grown quieter, but Naomi felt the weight of tension pressing from all sides. Passengers whispered among themselves, the subtle vibrations of murmurs and stifled gasps amplifying the sense of unease. Naomi's grip on Amara tightened instinctively, her knuckles whitening as she sensed that Susan's anger had not dissipated, but smoldered beneath a veneer of professional composure. The flight attendant's movements were sharp, deliberate, almost predatory, as if each step toward the galley or down the aisle was a calculated assertion of control. Naomi tried to steady her breathing. She could feel the collective energy of the cabin, a potent mixture of fear, judgment, and curiosity. Every gaze that lingered on her, every sideways glance, carried an invisible weight, pressing against her resolve. She knew that staying composed required more than patience. It demanded a deliberate mastery of both her body and her thoughts. Naomi's mind flickered to all the potential scenarios. What could happen if Susan tried to escalate the situation again? How could she protect Amara, herself, and even the bystanders from a confrontation that could spiral out of control? Susan's eyes locked on Naomi across the aisle, and Naomi felt the intensity of the gaze like a physical force. She recognized it for what it was: frustration, humiliation, and a desperate need to reassert authority. Naomi's inner voice urged caution, reminding her that reacting impulsively could inflame the situation. Yet, another part of her, a more primal and protective instinct, stirred restlessly. She was ready to confront, ready to defend. But she also knew that the right timing and composure were everything in a high-stakes environment. Ethan, who had remained near Naomi, whispered, "She's not done yet." "You can feel it." Naomi nodded without looking at him, her mind calculating each potential move, each subtle adjustment she could make to maintain control of the situation. The weight of responsibility pressed down hard. This was not merely a personal conflict. It had become a public drama unfolding in real time, a microcosm of broader societal dynamics and human behavior under stress. Susan's voice finally broke the silence, calm, but carrying a barely concealed edge. "Ma'am, if you could please keep your child in the seat-belted position, it's for safety." The words seemed innocuous, but Naomi recognized the undertone of challenge, a subtle attempt to reclaim authority. Naomi's eyes lifted to meet Susan's, steady and unwavering. "Amara is fine in my arms. She's secure, and she is not a threat to anyone. Please focus on safety, not theatrics." Her voice was measured, calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of conviction. Passengers leaned slightly forward, sensing the brewing confrontation. Naomi felt the heat of their attention, some sympathetic, some judgmental, and some simply hungry for drama. She could feel the pulse of collective observation, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Naomi knew that this moment would define the trajectory of the flight, the perception of her courage, and the social judgment that would inevitably follow. Susan's expression hardened, a flash of resentment crossing her features. She stepped closer, voice rising slightly. "I am asking you as a professional to follow the rules. You are not the only one responsible for safety." Naomi held her ground, inhaling slowly and speaking deliberately. "I am following the rules for Amara's safety. Your personal feelings do not dictate What is safe for my child? Her words hung in the air like a challenge, calm yet unyielding, exposing Susan's internal contradictions to the watchful eyes of the cabin. The atmosphere thickened, tension vibrating through the air like an electric charge. Some passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Others leaned forward, drawn into the moral and emotional gravity of the scene. Naomi's gaze swept over them briefly, noting the subtle signs of empathy, fear, and curiosity. Each person became part of a collective witness, a participant in an unfolding narrative that tested the limits of human civility and courage. Susan took a deliberate step back, perhaps realizing the social and professional stakes of continuing the confrontation. Naomi sensed the internal struggle, anger and pride fighting against the awareness of public scrutiny. Yet Susan's composure remained fragile, her movements now a delicate dance between confrontation and restraint. Naomi recognized the patterns of human behavior she had studied and experienced in moments of heightened stress. Power struggles became both internal and external battles, and the resolution often depended on who could maintain moral and emotional clarity under pressure. Amara stirred slightly in Naomi's arms, drawing Naomi's attention and grounding her once more. The baby's soft coos reminded her of the stakes beyond words and authority. This was about protection, care, and the small but profound acts of courage that define parenthood. Naomi's inner voice urged patience and strategy. She knew that escalation could lead to consequences she could not control, and yet she also knew that yielding would compromise her sense of integrity and justice. Ethan moved subtly closer, capturing reactions without interfering, aware of the historical weight of this confrontation. Naomi glanced at him briefly. Recognizing the duality of being observed, the presence of witnesses could amplify fear, but it could also strengthen resolve. Her determination solidified, rooted in both moral clarity and the undeniable instinct to protect Amara. Naomi had learned over time that courage was not the absence of fear, but the deliberate choice to act in alignment with values, despite fear. Susan's approach became more measured, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the lingering resentment. She addressed another flight attendant, her words hushed but urgent, a silent acknowledgment that the confrontation had exceeded the bounds of routine protocol. Naomi recognized the dynamic. Susan's attempt to reassert control had been thwarted by the moral and emotional strength of another, and now the cabin bore witness to the subtle power shift. The murmur of passengers intensified slightly, some whispering support, others expressing disbelief, and a few simply observing in silence. Naomi sensed that the confrontation had transcended individual personalities. It had become a social experiment in morality, courage, and human empathy. Each action, each word, was a data point in the collective consciousness of the cabin, and Naomi felt the weight of representing both her own values and the broader principles of dignity and respect. Susan's internal conflict became more evident with each passing moment. Naomi could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes. Shame, pride, fear, and defiance intertwined in a complicated dance. Naomi recognized the familiar patterns of human behavior when authority is questioned, a mixture of denial, justification, and an instinctive drive to reclaim perceived control. It was a delicate, explosive mix, and Naomi understood that her calm presence was both a shield and a subtle provocation. The hum of the engines continued, a constant reminder of the confined and inescapable setting. Naomi felt the tension in the air like a living thing, pressing against her and the other passengers, bending reality into a heightened state of emotional awareness. She held Amara close, drawing strength from the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing, and realized that the confrontation was as much internal as it was external. Each participant wrestled with values, fear, and social expectations, and Naomi's choice to maintain dignity was both a personal and collective act. As Susan finally paused, a subtle shift occurred in the cabin's energy. Naomi could feel the momentary reprieve, the fragile balance between confrontation and resolution. The flight continued, each passenger carrying the silent imprint of the event. Naomi's heart raced, not from fear, but from the intensity of moral engagement. She understood that the stakes were not merely procedural, they were profoundly human, testing the resilience, empathy, and courage of everyone present. In this suspended moment, Naomi reflected on the duality of confrontation and resolution. True courage, she realized, required both the willingness to confront injustice and the wisdom to navigate social and moral complexities with clarity and compassion. The tension had escalated, yes, but it had also illuminated the profound dynamics of human behavior under stress. Pride, empathy, fear, and courage intertwined in ways that define not only individual character, but the collective conscience of those who bore witness. Naomi's gaze returned to Amara, whose eyes were wide and curious, and she felt an unspoken promise to navigate every challenge with integrity, awareness, and strength. She knew the journey ahead, both on this flight and beyond, would continue to test boundaries, provoke moral reflection, and demand the careful balancing of courage, empathy, and resilience. And in that moment, suspended between turbulence and calm, conflict and resolution, Naomi Carter embodied a quiet, profound power that extended far beyond the confines of the aircraft cabin. The cabin had finally settled into a tense quiet. Naomi Carter sat holding Amara close, feeling the baby's steady breathing against her chest. Her mind was still alert, tracing every detail of the confrontation, replaying it with a meticulous awareness that almost bordered on obsessive. The hum of the engines was the only sound punctuating the silence. But in that calm, Naomi felt the echo of judgmental eyes, whispered reactions, and subtle glances of both approval and skepticism. She realized that the flight had become more than a journey. It had transformed into a stage where moral choices were observed, scrutinized, and internalized by everyone present. Naomi's thoughts drifted towards Susan Miller. Naomi could almost see the storm of emotions behind her colleague's professional mass pride, shame, anger, and defensiveness all intertwining. Susan had confronted Naomi with authority, attempting to assert control over a situation she perceived as disorderly. Yet she had underestimated the depth of Naomi's composure, empathy, and resolve. Naomi wondered what Susan would do next. Would she reflect on her actions and recognize the ethical misstep? Or would she continue to rationalize behavior that had alienated not only Naomi, but the witnesses around them? The uncertainty gnawed at Naomi, a subtle tension in the aftermath of conflict. Ethan Rivera positioned himself quietly nearby, documenting subtle reactions without disturbing the fragile calm. Naomi was aware of his presence, sensing both reassurance and scrutiny. She glanced at him and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgment that their shared observation of human behavior carried weight, that the events unfolding would leave imprints far beyond the confines of this flight. Naomi felt a mixture of responsibility and vulnerability, aware that the moral narrative created here would ripple outward, carried in memory, conversation, and perhaps even social media posts. Amara shifted slightly, her tiny hand brushing against Naomi's cheek, grounding her in the tangible, immediate responsibilities of motherhood. Naomi drew a deep breath and focused on the baby's presence. a quiet anchor in the storm of heightened emotions. She reflected on the complexity of human behavior. Authority wielded poorly could provoke conflict, while integrity maintained under pressure could transform a situation into a subtle lesson in courage and empathy. Naomi recognized that the cabin was a microcosm of society, a compressed arena where social norms, moral reasoning, and human behavior collided with a particular intensity. Susan Miller, standing near the galley, appeared momentarily introspective. Naomi observed the subtle cues, the tightening of her jaw, the brief downward glance, and the hesitant repositioning of her flight attendant apron. Naomi felt a quiet curiosity about Susan's internal reckoning. Was she grappling with embarrassment, guilt, or the social weight of having her actions publicly witnessed? Naomi understood that personal reflection often arrived slowly, sometimes only when one could no longer defend impulsive choices with authority or ego. It was a human process that required humility, awareness, and the courage to confront one's own misjudgments. Passengers around Naomi remained alert, though the intensity had softened slightly. Some whispered quietly to each other, some avoided eye contact, and others stared ahead as if ruminating on the social dynamics they had just witnessed. Naomi recognized the variety of human responses: fear, empathy, moral contemplation, and simple curiosity. Each individual navigated their own internal moral landscape, shaped by the drama unfolding in front of them. Naomi's heart swelled with a mixture of compassion and fatigue. Realizing the emotional labor she had invested was not hers alone, but had spread throughout the cabin, leaving invisible traces in the consciousness of each witness. Naomi's mind wandered to her own values and principles, the framework that had allowed her to remain composed during the confrontation. She thought of the countless moments in her life when she had faced judgment, resistance, or authority that challenged her integrity. Each experience had honed her capacity for patience, empathy, and moral clarity. Naomi realized that her strength did not come from physical prowess or aggression, but from an understanding of human complexity and a willingness to act in alignment with her values, even under pressure. Susan, by contrast, seemed caught in a different emotional loop. Naomi imagined the self-justifications running through her mind, the explanations for behavior that might never withstand moral scrutiny. Naomi's inner voice acknowledged the subtle danger of rationalization, the way humans construct narratives to protect ego while avoiding accountability. Naomi recognized the potential for Susan to learn, to evolve, but also the likelihood that defensiveness could perpetuate cycles of misjudgment and ethical blindness. The contrast between their internal experiences was stark, yet it illuminated a universal truth. The choices we make under observation define not only how others perceive us, but also how we perceive ourselves. Amara, sensing the shift in emotional energy, began to coo softly, drawing attention from a few nearby passengers who smiled or leaned closer with gentle curiosity. Naomi's heart softened. She realized that amidst conflict and moral tension, moments of innocence and connection had the power to diffuse fear, to remind observers of the shared humanity underlying every confrontation. The baby's presence acted as a subtle moral lens, forcing everyone to reckon not only with behavior, but with the broader implications for care, empathy, and social responsibility. Ethan, still attentive, quietly whispered, "The tension is fading, but the lesson is clear." Naomi nodded slightly, absorbing the truth of his observation. She understood that the events of this flight were more than a personal ordeal. They were a catalyst for reflection, a test of moral courage for all involved. The cabin, once charged with confrontation, had transformed into a space of contemplation, Naomi sensed the subtle shift in energy, the collective awareness that integrity and empathy mattered more than authority or impulse. Naomi allowed herself a brief moment of introspection. She considered her own fear and anger during the confrontation, recognizing the physiological and emotional responses that had coursed through her body. The adrenaline, the rapid heartbeat, the instinctive protectiveness toward Amara, all of it was real. And yet Naomi had navigated these responses with deliberate calm. She felt a quiet pride in her ability to remain anchored, not for the sake of performance, but for the sake of moral clarity and the safety of her child. Susan, now standing further away, seemed to withdraw into herself. Naomi sensed the subtle weight of accountability settling over her colleague. It was not dramatic, nor was it immediately visible to the casual observer, but the ethical tension remained palpable. Naomi recognized that true reckoning was often internal, unseen, yet profoundly impactful. It required confronting discomfort, reassessing choices, and integrating lessons into future behavior. Naomi knew that this was a process Susan might begin now, or perhaps delay indefinitely. As the flight continued, Naomi felt a growing sense of responsibility not only for Amara, but also for the moral tone she set in the cabin. She realized that leadership and courage were not limited to positions of formal authority. Sometimes they manifested in quiet, consistent adherence to principles, in the ability to stand firm against injustice, and in the skill to navigate conflict with empathy and composure. Naomi's reflections deepened, reinforcing her understanding that morality was active, situational, and observable, and that her actions had ripple effects extending far beyond herself. Naomi shifted slightly, drawing Amara closer as the baby's eyes met hers. The connection was grounding, a reminder of the essential purpose behind every moral choice. Protection, care, empathy, and courage were not abstract ideals. They were lived experiences, practiced in real time, tested by circumstances both ordinary and extraordinary. Naomi felt a profound sense of resolve to continue modeling integrity, to navigate conflict with wisdom, and to embody the quiet strength that would guide not only her child, but all those who observed and learned from her example. The cabin remained alert yet subdued. Passengers absorbed the weight of the moral dynamics unfolding around them. Naomi sensed a subtle but growing awareness the importance of empathy, the courage to uphold principles, and the consequences of choices under scrutiny. She reflected on the social fabric that bound them all, recognizing that in moments of confrontation and reflection, humanity revealed both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. As Naomi continued to hold Amara, she understood that the moral reckoning unfolding in the cabin was a shared experience, one that would linger in memory, influence interactions, and shape perceptions of justice, courage, and empathy. The flight, though physically uneventful in its progression, had become a crucible for moral awareness, testing the capacity of individuals to act with integrity and compassion under pressure. Naomi's gaze softened, her resolve unwavering, as she embraced the responsibility and insight that emerged from the intense, transformative encounter. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin with a steady rhythm, but Naomi Carter felt every vibration as if it were amplified by her heightened awareness. She cradled Amara close, feeling the warmth of her daughter against her chest and the subtle, steady heartbeat that reminded her of the responsibility she carried. She had thought the confrontation with Susan Miller had reached its peak, that the tension had settled into a cautious equilibrium, but the subtle shift in cabin energy told her that the story was far from over. From the galley, the sliding of a metal cart echoed sharply, drawing Naomi's attention. A tall man in a sharply pressed uniform emerged, moving with a purposeful stride that immediately commanded attention. His eyes scanned the cabin with a mix of scrutiny and authority. Naomi instinctively straightened, feeling the familiar tension of being observed. The man's presence was imposing yet calm, the kind of professional assurance that could diffuse or escalate a situation depending on how it was received. Ethan Rivera, sitting nearby, leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Who is that?" Naomi's eyes narrowed, tracking the man's movements. She recognized him immediately from the flight manifest Robert Caldwell, a senior safety inspector assigned to observe high-profile flights for protocol compliance. His arrival was unannounced, which explained the sudden spike in tension. Naomi felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief, because a neutral authority could restore order. Apprehension, because scrutiny under such circumstances often magnified every detail of human error. Robert's gaze paused on Naomi and Amara, registering the mother and child at the center of the previous confrontation. His expression was unreadable, the kind of mask that revealed nothing but suggested that he was cataloging information internally. Naomi felt a small surge of protective instinct, tightening her hold on Amara. She knew the story was far from hers alone now. Every action, every glance, and every expression would be evaluated, dissected, and recorded. Susan Miller, sensing the shift, stiffened immediately. Naomi noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the tightening of her jaw, and the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. It was clear that Susan had not anticipated this intervention. Naomi's heart pulsed with cautious awareness. She knew that the arrival of Robert Caldwell would either force Susan into immediate accountability or provoke further defensiveness that could escalate the situation. The delicate balance of authority and emotion in the cabin was about to tip. Robert began moving down the aisle methodically, stopping briefly at each row to observe passenger behavior and cabin atmosphere. Naomi watched him with careful attention, noting how each passenger's subtle shifts revealed the layers of social judgment, fear, and empathy in response to the earlier confrontation. Naomi felt a strange mixture of vindication and anxiety. She understood that the events had already left a mark on every observer, and now, under the scrutiny of formal authority, those marks would crystallize into official records and possibly consequences. Susan, now aware that she was under direct observation, attempted to reclaim composure. She adjusted her apron, straightened her posture, and approached Robert cautiously. "Inspector Caldwell, may I clarify the situation?" she asked. Her voice measured but tinged with defensiveness. Naomi could sense the undercurrent of tension in her tone, the attempt to assert authority while masking uncertainty. Naomi's inner awareness told her that Susan was at a crossroads, either admit the misstep and face accountability, or double down on control, risking further escalation. Robert's response was calm but pointed. "I am here to observe. I will need a full account of the interaction between you and the passenger in seat 14B. His gaze briefly flicked toward Naomi, acknowledging her presence as a central figure in the incident. Naomi felt a wave of pressure. She had anticipated scrutiny, but the direct attention of a senior authority elevated the stakes. The responsibility she carried now was amplified not only by her role as a mother, but by the visibility of her ethical stance under professional evaluation. Ethan leaned closer to Naomi and murmured, "This could change everything." Naomi nodded slightly, feeling the truth of his words. The situation was no longer confined to interpersonal tension. It had transformed into a test of institutional accountability and social integrity. She understood that every word she spoke, every gesture she made, could influence the outcome, set a precedent, and affect not only the immediate conflict, but broader perceptions of fairness, authority, and moral courage. Susan Miller, sensing the rising tension, attempted to interject. The passenger was creating a disruption, and I acted to maintain order. Her tone was defensive yet measured, a clear attempt to frame the narrative in her favor. Naomi felt the familiar surge of calm determination that had guided her through previous confrontations. She knew that any emotional reaction, no matter how justified, could be misinterpreted. Instead, she drew a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of inner centering before responding with clarity and composed authority. I was seated with my child, calmly minding our space. Naomi began, her voice soft but unwavering. There was no disruption from my side. The escalation came from a disproportionate use of authority that was unprovoked. I believe every passenger witnessed the interaction and can attest to the sequence of events. She felt a subtle shift in cabin energy as her words landed, the quiet recognition of her composure resonating with those around her. Robert Caldwell nodded, noting details in his tablet without interrupting. His presence was a stabilizing force. Yet Naomi sensed that the real challenge was not his scrutiny, but the ripple effect it would create within the cabin and beyond. She considered the social and ethical implications of the confrontation authority misapplied, personal dignity threatened, and the subtle power dynamics that played out in confined spaces where observation was unavoidable. Naomi's thoughts were precise, methodical, and deeply aware of the broader moral context. Amara stirred slightly, sensing her mother's emotional intensity. Naomi held her closer, drawing comfort and clarity from the child's presence. The simple human connection reminded Naomi that amidst escalating tension, the stakes of empathy, protection, and ethical responsibility were grounded in lived reality. She was no longer responding merely to an individual confrontation, but to a web of moral and social expectations that encompassed authority, accountability, and the witnessing of justice in real time. Susan's internal struggle became more visible. Naomi noticed her hesitation, the slight lowering of her gaze, and the brief faltering of her professional facade. Naomi understood that the intervention had forced Susan into a moment of self-reflection. The potential for acknowledgement, apology, or defensive escalation hung in the air. Naomi's awareness extended beyond personal vindication. She recognized the opportunity for systemic accountability, ethical modeling, and the subtle shaping of future professional behavior through the lens of this encounter. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves, exchanging looks that reflected a mixture of relief, curiosity, and moral contemplation. Naomi felt the emotional reverberations of her actions extending outward, touching the lives of those who had witnessed not only the conflict, but the principled response it had elicited. She considered the ripple effect of courage and ethical clarity in small, high-stakes social arenas, how a single act of moral composure could influence perceptions, behavior, and collective consciousness. Robert Caldwell's final observation included a deliberate pause near Naomi and Amara. He looked at the baby, then at Naomi, and finally at Susan, as if weighing the moral gravity of the incident against professional protocols and human behavior. Naomi felt a mixture of anticipation and calm resolve. The outcome was not yet formalized, but the presence of clear moral reasoning, composed articulation, and ethical fortitude created a palpable sense of integrity that could not be ignored. The cabin's atmosphere remained taut but stable. Naomi recognized the subtle triumph not as personal victory, but as the affirmation of moral clarity, patience, and composed resilience. She allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection, sensing the profound impact of ethical conduct on both immediate observers and the broader social narrative. The plane continued its journey, yet in this contained space, the events had crystallized into a living example of courage, accountability, and human responsibility. Naomi drew a deep breath, adjusting Amar in her arms. The baby's soft cooing was grounding, a gentle reminder of the stakes that truly mattered. Naomi's mind was clear. She had navigated conflict with integrity, modeled calm, ethical reasoning, and maintained protective awareness. The unexpected intervention had intensified the tension, but it had also illuminated the strength of principled action and the subtle power of witnessing ethical courage in a shared social space. The cabin felt unusually quiet, despite the low hum of the engines, as if the collective breath of every passenger had been held for the unfolding drama. Naomi Carter cradled Amara in her arms, feeling the soft weight of her daughter and the unspoken responsibility that had grown heavier with each tense moment. The presence of Robert Caldwell added an unexpected layer of scrutiny, and Naomi could feel the shifting dynamics of authority pressing against Susan Miller's fragile composure. Susan, standing near the galley, had straightened her posture several times, attempting to project professionalism, but Naomi noticed the subtle tremor in her fingers and the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Every movement she made seemed calculated, yet vulnerable under the steady gaze of the inspector. Naomi's heart pounded, not in fear, but in readiness. She knew that the upcoming interaction would determine whether this ordeal ended in accountability or escalation. Robert moved deliberately toward the center aisle, his presence commanding quiet attention from passengers and crew alike. He stopped a few feet from Naomi, scanning the space between her and Susan. The weight of his observation pressed against the invisible walls of tension that had been building for the past hour. Naomi felt a strange mix of anxiety and calm determination. She understood that any misstep now could overshadow her ethical stance, but she also knew that staying composed would make her position undeniable. Susan took a deep breath and spoke, her voice a mixture of defensiveness and strained authority. "Inspector Caldwell, I followed protocol. The passenger was disruptive, and I acted to maintain order. Any escalation was a result of her non-compliance." Her words were precise, yet Naomi could sense the undercurrent of fear that betrayed her outward confidence. Naomi, feeling the familiar surge of inner strength, prepared herself to respond. She knew this was not simply a dispute about seating or manners, but a profound test of justice, empathy, and moral clarity in a confined space. Naomi's voice was steady and soft, carrying a quiet authority that contrasted with Susan's defensive rigidity. There was no disruption from my side. I was seated with my child, attending to her needs, and following all instructions given. The escalation occurred only when excessive force and misapplied authority were directed at me. Multiple passengers witnessed the interaction, and their accounts would corroborate the sequence of events. She allowed a brief pause, letting her words resonate within the cabin. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with anticipation and ethical tension, Robert Caldwell observed, making notes without interrupting, his expression unreadable yet attentive. Naomi felt the pressure of being evaluated, but she drew strength from her inner clarity. Every word she spoke, every pause she allowed, was a deliberate act of composed truth. She focused on the moral weight of the moment, understanding that the resolution depended not on anger or retribution, but on unwavering adherence to integrity and calm presence. Susan, sensing the intensity of the scrutiny, tried to assert control. "Inspector, my role is to maintain safety. I acted to protect passengers from potential disorder. It was my duty to intervene." Her tone wavered slightly, betraying the conflict within her. Naomi could feel the subtle tension ripple through the cabin, a mix of passengers' curiosity, empathy, and judgment converging on this confrontation. Naomi's mind worked swiftly, weighing her options, preparing her next words with the precision of someone who understood the stakes of ethical accountability. Naomi responded with composed clarity. Safety cannot come at the cost of dignity, respect, or disproportionate action. The choice to escalate physically against a mother holding her infant was unnecessary and avoidable. The witnesses, including the passengers seated nearby, observed a clear misuse of authority. Accountability and reflection are essential to prevent harm in situations like these. Her voice carried a quiet power, the kind that drew attention not through volume, but through undeniable moral resonance. The cabin remained still, save for the occasional shuffle of passengers shifting in their seats, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and concern. Ethan Rivera leaned slightly forward, recording subtle gestures and expressions, noting the moral tension that now hung palpably in the air. Naomi felt a deep connection to the collective human experience, in that moment the witnessing of conflict, the struggle for fairness, and the delicate balance between authority and empathy. Robert Caldwell finally spoke, his voice calm yet decisive. Both accounts have been noted. The actions observed will be reviewed in detail. Immediate measures will be taken to ensure accountability and proper handling of similar incidents in the future. It is clear that this situation required ethical discernment, and the responses of both parties have been documented. His statement carried the weight of institutional authority, but also acknowledged the moral stakes of the interaction. Naomi allowed herself a quiet exhale, feeling the tension ease slightly as formal recognition of her perspective was established. She held Amara close, drawing comfort from the baby's soft breathing and gentle movements. Susan Miller's posture slackened subtly, the rigid veneer giving way to the realization that the confrontation had not gone unnoticed and that her actions had tangible consequences. Naomi sensed the beginning of an internal reckoning within her adversary, the slow acknowledgement of the moral implications of her behavior. The passengers, who had witnessed the unfolding events, began to relax as well. Subtle murmurs of acknowledgement and reassurance passed quietly through the rows. Naomi noticed nods, brief glances of solidarity, and expressions of quiet respect. She understood that the impact of ethical courage extended beyond immediate accountability. It had fostered a shared understanding of justice and integrity among those present. Naomi reflected internally on the journey of the past hour, the initial confrontation, the misapplied authority, the intervention, and the eventual clarity achieved through composed moral reasoning. She felt a profound sense of responsibility not only as a mother protecting her child, but as an individual whose actions influenced the ethical landscape of her immediate environment. The ordeal had transformed into a lived lesson in courage, empathy, and principled action. Susan Miller, seated now near the rear of the plane after Robert's intervention, appeared introspective. Naomi noticed her hands fidgeting slightly, her eyes tracing patterns on the tray table, and the subtle tension in her shoulders. Naomi recognized the internal struggle of someone forced to confront their misjudgment, the cognitive dissonance of maintaining authority while realizing the moral failure inherent in excessive action. Naomi felt no vindictiveness, only the quiet satisfaction of witnessing an opportunity for growth and reflection. As the plane began its descent, the cabin atmosphere shifted from tension to cautious relief. Naomi cradled Amara, feeling the gentle rhythm of the landing vibrations and the shared human relief that accompanied the end of a high-stakes journey. She understood that while the confrontation had concluded formally, The lessons learned and the ripple effects of principled action would persist far beyond the confines of the airplane. In those final moments before touchdown, Naomi allowed herself a rare smile, not of triumph, but of quiet affirmation. She had navigated a complex moral landscape with composure, protected her child, and maintained ethical clarity under intense scrutiny. The resolution was not merely procedural, it was human, social, and deeply reflective of the power of courage and empathy in the face of misuse of authority. The cabin had finally settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal after the tense confrontation. Yet Naomi Carter knew that nothing on this flight would ever truly feel ordinary again. She cradled Amara, who had dozed off in her arms, her soft breaths a steady rhythm against Naomi's chest. The hum of the engine seemed almost soothing now, a constant reminder of movement, of transition, of the inevitability of forward motion. Naomi allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the lingering weight of the tension and the emotional exhaustion that had built up during the ordeal. As she looked around the cabin, Naomi noticed the subtle shifts in the passengers' expressions. Some were quietly exchanging glances, others seemed lost in thought, and a few were tentatively approaching her with nods of acknowledgement. Naomi's heart softened at these small gestures. The solidarity and silent recognition of shared humanity were unexpectedly comforting, yet beneath the surface, Naomi felt the complex mix of emotions that came with being at the center of a morally charged confrontation relief: fatigue, lingering anger, and a profound awareness of responsibility. Susan Miller sat a few rows away, her posture slumped and shoulders heavy with visible tension. Naomi observed her quietly, not with malice, but with empathy. Susan's face reflected a storm of inner conflict, embarrassment, defensiveness, and the dawning realization of her own actions. Naomi could almost trace the internal dialogue playing out behind those eyes. She imagined Susan questioning herself, the chain of decisions that had led to the moment when authority had tipped into misuse, and the quiet dread of accountability settling in. It was a moment of reckoning, not imposed from outside, but slowly emerging from within. Naomi's mind wandered to her own internal journey during the confrontation. She had felt fear, certainly, but more profoundly she had felt the pull of moral clarity. Every word, every movement, every breath had been measured with the weight of responsibility for her child and the ethical imperative to act with integrity. Naomi reflected on the subtle strength it required to remain calm when provoked, to assert one's rights and dignity without escalating into aggression. It was a lesson in self-possession and the quiet power of standing firm in one's values. Ethan Rivera, seated near the window, had been quietly observing the events, his notebook now closed on his lap. Naomi caught his eye and saw the respect and curiosity reflected there. She understood that the story of the confrontation would extend beyond the plane, carried in the impressions left on those who had witnessed the moral and emotional complexity of the situation. There was a silent transmission of ethical reflection happening, a ripple effect that spread through the cabin, touching even those who had remained physically distant from the conflict. Naomi's thoughts returned to her daughter. Amara stirred slightly, a soft murmur escaping her lips. Naomi's hand instinctively stroked her hair, a grounding gesture, anchoring her in the immediate reality of love and care. The baby's presence had been a lens through which Naomi had experienced the confrontation differently than she might have on her own. The vulnerability and trust inherent in holding her child had amplified every ethical consideration, every instinct to protect, to speak truthfully, and to act decisively without compromising calmness. Susan Miller shifted in her seat, catching Naomi's gaze for a brief moment. There was a flicker of something Naomi could not fully name regret. Confusion. Perhaps a tentative acknowledgement of the error that had occurred. Naomi felt a curious empathy, recognizing that growth and reflection often come from discomfort and confrontation. She wondered how Susan would process the incident once she was alone, away from the eyes of the passengers and inspectors. Naomi understood the slow, sometimes painful journey of self-awareness that followed a breach of ethical judgment. Robert Caldwell remained standing near the front of the cabin, his expression composed, his posture authoritative, yet not imposing. Naomi considered his role in the aftermath. The presence of someone who represented structured authority had shaped the confrontation's resolution, but the deeper impact lay in the personal reflection it prompted for those involved. Naomi recognized that accountability was most meaningful when it prompted introspection, the reconsideration of one's actions and motives, and the eventual alignment of behavior with moral principles. Naomi felt a wave of fatigue wash over her, yet it was accompanied by an unexpected clarity. She realized that the confrontation had been more than a challenge to authority. It had been a test of moral courage, patience, and empathy under scrutiny. Every subtle gesture, every choice to speak or remain silent, every moment of restraint had contributed to the eventual resolution. Naomi understood that the emotional weight she carried now was a measure of her engagement with these principles, and she accepted it with quiet dignity. As the plane continued its descent, Naomi found herself reflecting on the broader implications of the incident. It was a microcosm of society itself, a space where authority, responsibility, vulnerability, and ethical choice intersected. She thought about the systemic pressures that often led individuals to misuse authority, the moments when fear or insecurity might override ethical reasoning, and the ways in which courage and composure could counterbalance these tendencies. Naomi felt a deep sense of responsibility to embody the values she had relied upon during the confrontation, to carry them forward in her life beyond the airplane. Ethan Rivera scribbled a few notes, occasionally glancing up, capturing not just events but the emotional landscape of the cabin. Naomi wondered what he would make of it all, how he would interpret the subtle interplay of power, fear, courage, and reflection. She felt a quiet appreciation for the observers, those who bore witness without interference, but whose awareness contributed to the ethical gravity of the situation. Their silent acknowledgement added layers of accountability that extended beyond formal authority. Susan Miller had withdrawn into herself somewhat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Naomi sensed that she was processing the confrontation internally, oscillating between self-justification and the dawning understanding of error. Naomi allowed herself a moment of compassion, recognizing that the discomfort Susan felt was part of a larger process of moral learning, a moment of confrontation with one's own ethical boundaries that was often painful but ultimately transformative. Amara stirred again, drawing Naomi's attention back to the immediate, tangible world. Naomi smiled softly, feeling the simplicity and profundity of maternal connection. The baby's calm presence reminded her that life's challenges, however intense or morally complex, were lived through relationships, care, and the steady persistence of love. Naomi realized that the ethical clarity she had practiced on the plane was inseparable from her commitment to protecting and nurturing her child, and that this connection had been a source of strength and resolve throughout the ordeal. The descent continued, and Naomi allowed herself to contemplate the unfolding sense of closure. The confrontation had reached a formal resolution, but the emotional and moral aftermath lingered, weaving a complex tapestry of reflection, accountability, and growth. She felt a deep respect for the human capacity to navigate ethical dilemmas, for the resilience required to maintain composure under scrutiny, and for the power of empathy to transform even moments of conflict into opportunities for understanding. Naomi looked out the window as the city lights began to shimmer below. She felt a sense of grounding and perspective, a quiet reminder that life continued beyond this confined space, yet that the lessons learned here would resonate far beyond the boundaries of the airplane cabin. She understood that every ethical choice, every moment of courage or compassion, created ripples that extended into the broader world, shaping relationships, influencing others, and contributing to a shared human narrative of integrity and empathy. In those final moments before touchdown, Naomi allowed herself to fully release the tension that had been coiled so tightly within her. She cradled Amara with renewed awareness, acknowledging the profound responsibility, love, and courage that the journey had demanded. She felt a quiet pride, not in triumph over another person, but in the affirmation of her own ethical clarity, the endurance of patience, and the transformative power of calm, principled action. The plane began its final descent, the city lights growing larger and more distinct beneath the wings. Naomi Carter held Amara a little tighter, her thoughts tracing the events that had unfolded over the past hour. The hum of the engines had transformed from a background comfort to a steady heartbeat guiding them toward closure. Every passenger seemed caught in a shared, silent reflection of what had happened. And Naomi understood that this landing would mark not only the physical arrival, but also a symbolic conclusion to the confrontation that had shaken the cabin to its core. Susan Miller, the flight attendant whose actions had triggered the ordeal, was now seated quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Naomi could sense the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders remained stiff despite the absence of immediate conflict. There was no visible acknowledgement, no verbal apology, but Naomi perceived a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet recognition that what had transpired could not be undone. It was an unspoken confrontation with conscience, the sort of reckoning that only comes in private moments of reflection. Yet Naomi felt it was as meaningful as any formal acknowledgement could be. Naomi's thoughts turned to Robert Caldwell, the senior flight inspector who had observed the incident with a composed but critical eye. Caldwell had been both authority and witness, a stabilizing force during the heated moments that threatened to escalate further. Naomi admired the balance he had maintained, recognizing that his presence had allowed the confrontation to remain contained while still demanding accountability. She felt a subtle gratitude for the structure he provided, the way he had quietly reinforced that justice could exist even in the confines of a crowded airplane. As the landing gear deployed with a soft mechanical hum, Naomi reflected on the way each passenger had been affected. Ethan Rivera, the student who had been documenting the scene, had been particularly observant, capturing not only actions, but emotional nuances, the small gestures, the fleeting expressions, the silent exchanges of tension and empathy. Naomi felt a wave of admiration for his attentiveness, realizing that his notes might carry the story beyond this flight, shaping the understanding of others and amplifying the moral lessons embedded in the confrontation. The idea that their experience might influence a wider audience gave Naomi a sense of purpose, a reminder that even chaotic moments could produce meaningful insight. Amara stirred slightly, pressing her small face against Naomi's chest. Naomi smiled down at her daughter, feeling a swell of protective pride. It was clear now that the events had tested more than just patience and courage. They had tested the capacity for ethical clarity under pressure, the ability to maintain composure in moments of public scrutiny, and the strength of a mother's instinct to protect her child without compromising her own principles. Naomi realized that the lesson extended beyond the immediate conflict. It was about living with integrity in every situation, no matter how intense or morally complex. The plane shuddered lightly as it touched down, and the sound of tires against the runway created a tangible sense of arrival. Naomi exhaled deeply, feeling the release of tension that had held her body rigid for so long. Around her, passengers stirred, some leaning back with a sigh of relief, others exchanging tentative smiles that carried the weight of shared experience. Naomi noticed Susan Miller glancing briefly toward her, a fleeting moment of eye contact that seemed to carry an unspoken message. Naomi acknowledged it with a quiet nod, a gesture that said more than words could convey a recognition of the shared humanity that had been tested and revealed in the confrontation. The taxi to the gate was slow, providing Naomi with a few additional minutes to process the intensity of the situation. She considered the broader implications, the societal context in which incidents like this occurred. It was not merely a personal conflict. It reflected larger dynamics of power, privilege, and prejudice. Naomi thought about the subtle ways authority could be misused and the courage required to stand up against it, particularly when doing so placed one in a vulnerable position. The ethical clarity she had relied upon was a model of principled action, demonstrating that morality could be maintained even when provoked by fear, insecurity, or societal pressure. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the cabin lights brightened, casting a new glow on the passengers' faces. Naomi gently adjusted Amara in her arms, preparing to stand and disembark. The sense of closure was palpable but nuanced. It was not the dramatic triumph of a storybook ending, but the quiet, powerful resolution of integrity, reflection, and moral courage. Naomi felt a profound sense of responsibility, knowing that the way she navigated this experience would shape her understanding of herself, her daughter, and the world around her. Susan Miller remained seated as the majority of passengers stood to gather their belongings. Naomi approached her cautiously, mindful of the emotional complexity in the moment. Without accusation or anger, she simply spoke, her voice steady and calm. She did not demand an apology, nor did she seek validation. Instead, she expressed a simple truth that dignity and fairness were non-negotiable principles, essential in any space where human interactions carried weight and consequence. Susan listened, her expression unreadable at first, then softened slightly as Naomi continued. It was a brief exchange, quiet yet profound, leaving both women with the unspoken understanding that this confrontation had changed something fundamental within the cabin and within themselves. The disembarkation process was orderly but slow, allowing Naomi to observe the small gestures of solidarity from fellow passengers. Many offered polite smiles, some whispered words of encouragement, and a few nodded in quiet respect. Naomi felt a sense of connection that transcended the immediate conflict, a recognition that shared values could unite people even in tense and morally complex situations. She understood that the impact of the incident extended far beyond the walls of the airplane, influencing perceptions, challenging assumptions, and encouraging reflection in those who had witnessed it. Outside the plane, the cool evening air was a stark contrast to the contained environment of the cabin. Naomi adjusted Amara in the carrier, taking a moment to absorb the transition from confinement to openness. She felt a renewed sense of clarity, a calm awareness that while the confrontation had been intense and challenging, it had also illuminated the power of ethical resolve and human empathy. Naomi's internal struggle had not been with another person alone, but with the broader question of how to navigate moral complexity under scrutiny, a question she now felt prepared to face with confidence and grace. Robert Caldwell approached Naomi, offering a firm handshake and a respectful nod. His presence conveyed recognition, not merely for the actions taken, but for the composure, clarity, and principled stance she had maintained throughout. It was a moment of mutual acknowledgment that transcended the hierarchical structures of authority and reflected a deeper appreciation for ethical integrity. Naomi accepted his gesture with quiet gratitude, understanding that the true impact of the confrontation lay not in punitive measures, but in the reflection and growth it inspired. Ethan Rivera lingered nearby, notebook in hand, capturing the final impressions of the flight. Naomi noticed his thoughtful expression and smiled faintly. She realized that the story of this incident would ripple outward, reaching audiences who might never witness such events firsthand, but who would benefit from the lessons embedded in human courage, empathy, and ethical action. It was a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there existed the potential to inspire reflection and understanding, to influence perceptions, and to contribute to a broader dialogue about fairness, responsibility, and human dignity. Naomi's mind returned to Amara, whose soft coos and curious eyes provided a grounding presence in the midst of reflection. She understood that her role as a mother extended beyond immediate protection. It encompassed the modeling of courage, integrity, and empathy. Every choice she made, every measured response, every act of moral clarity was a teaching moment for her daughter, an inheritance of values that would shape Amara's understanding of the world and the principles she would carry forward. As Naomi stepped onto the tarmac, the evening sky stretched wide and open above her, a canvas of possibility and reflection. The journey had been challenging, emotionally taxing, and ethically demanding, but it had also affirmed the power of resilience, moral courage, and human empathy. Naomi felt a profound sense of closure, not only in the resolution of the confrontation, but in the lasting impact it would leave on the passengers, the observers, and herself. The landing marked the end of a flight, but the lessons learned, the reflections prompted, and the moral clarity exercised would extend far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. In the quiet moments of transition, Naomi allowed herself to fully embrace the culmination of the experience. She understood that true resolution was not merely about the cessation of conflict, but about the integration of lessons, the acknowledgement of human fallibility, and the affirmation of ethical integrity. As she carried Amara toward the awaiting world beyond the gate, Naomi felt a profound sense of purpose, clarity, and hope. The confrontation had ended, but its impact would resonate, shaping the values, perceptions, and ethical consciousness of all who had witnessed it. As the plane doors finally open and the passengers step into the cool evening air, the echoes of what happened above the clouds linger in every mind. Naomi Carter's quiet courage and steadfast resolve remind us that even in the smallest acts, integrity and empathy can shine brighter than prejudice or anger. Her story is a mirror, reflecting both the fragility and the resilience of human dignity. We feel love for her strength, empathy for her struggle, and a deep sense of indignation for the injustice she faced. But beyond the emotional turmoil, the story leaves us questioning. How often do we witness such moments and remain silent? How can each of us stand up when injustice appears, even in subtle forms? This flight may have ended, but its lessons are far from over. It is a call to action, a reminder that awareness, courage, and compassion can ripple far beyond a single moment. If Naomi's journey moved you, inspired you, or made you pause, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us for more stories that challenge, touch, and empower.